the apple scene has survived in our culture, even though most people don't know why it happened, who he shot, when he shot it, how he did it, what was it about. They know nothing about it. But they sure as hell know that there was a little boy with an apple on his head and his dad was about to shoot him. And that's why I wanted to do the picture, because that scene written by Schiller is a pure example of political terrorism. It's the equivalence of people in yellow jumpsuits and orange jumpsuits in the desert getting their throat cut, and that being advertised on social media.
Hello. Early in the 14th century, Switzerland was under the control of their far more powerful neighbour, Hapsburg Austria. In the small town of Aldorf, in the canton of Uri, which is in the centre of Switzerland, near Lake Lucern, and not far from the city of Zurich, there lived a brutal Austrian governor, Albrecht Gessler. Gessler hated the Swiss, a proud and rebellious people, and to remind them of their subjugation, he placed his hat on a large post in the middle of the town square and demanded the Swiss bow when passing. William Tell, an expert crossbowman and hunter, refused. Furious, Gessler set Tell a challenge: shoot an apple off his son's head from 100 yards as the wretched child was tied to the post, or the boy would be executed. Tell reluctantly agreed, and with a miraculous shot he succeeded, and so began the revolt against Austria and Switzerland's journey to independence, for which it is known today, as well as dubious banking practices. Joining the podcast is the director Nick Hamm, who has made a film of William Tell starring Claes Bang, Ben Kingsley, Jonathan Price, Golshifter Farahani, Rafe Spall, Ellie Bamber and Connor Swindles. Also on the chat is the historian Almut Seurbaum. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do share with friends and like and follow. But in the meantime, it's William Tell with Nick and Almut. Nick, Almut, welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. It's fabulous to have you on, and I'm delighted, having just watched William Tell. So, Nick, I mean, you're a very distinguished director. I'm delighted to speak to you, actually, having watched a number of your films. And I remember way back in 1998, Martha.
Martha Meads.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
So great to speak to you. But and the journey as well. I love that. And so it's fantastic to have you on this podcast. We often talk films.
Great.
And William Tell, I'm very excited to speak to Alma about the historiography behind Mr. Tell. But Nick, I was very pleased to read that you, in the credits and in a bit of background reading, you've adapted this from a play written in the early 19th century. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. The original source material for the legend has really never been written down. So the only person to actually write it down was a playwright, a German playwright from the early 19th century called Friedrich Schiller. And Schiller was and is regarded as one of the great German writers of all time. He was a contemporary of Goethe. He wrote about 4 or 5 good plays, and William Tell was one of them. Now, William Tell's play is almost unperformable in terms of contemporary drama, in the sense that it's a hugely massive tome, overwritten in the way that early 19th century drama is well overwritten and it declares itself in different ways. But what it does do is it gave me an absolute real structure through which I could use that to adapt into a film format. It gave me character, and it gave me a language that, more importantly, that I wanted to try and keep, because the language that he uses, if the film's about the notion of political liberty and the attainment of that and how you keep it, how you fight for it, how you can lose it, and the cost of trying to do it, that's essentially what Schiller's writing about in huge detail at that period, which is very prescient to now. I wanted to keep that language. And so I tried to keep some of the Schiller, and I tried to write in the heightened language of Schiller, because it allowed me to express incredibly powerful political ideas in a very pithy, focused way. So there is a poetic element, I guess, is what I'm saying, to the language of the movie. But, you're looking at a story, from the early 14th century, written by a playwright, in 1806, 1807, and now put on a cinema in 2024, right? 2025. So this is a story that goes 400 or 500 years through history. So you have to ask yourself, why is that the case? What is it about something like William Tell that makes us interested? And what's the crossover between history, legend, and sheer invention?
Well, I was going to ask you about that because this story is of fascination to people over hundreds of years. The story's endured. And Almut will explain exactly when the story began, and it definitely happened. We all know that, I'm sure. But I remember reading the Penguin, I think, children's book, and I mean,
Yeah.
as a school child, I loved the story, and then having visited Switzerland often recently, I mean, I go pretty much every year to Switzerland, and there's something that I mean, I know it's a story that works globally. But is there something about the Swiss you think that, I mean, this is a nation that, I guess it's a federation of various cantons, but it's a sort of, as a group together as a country. Do you think this is something that you wanted to draw out in the movie, that there's a kind of Swiss patriotism?
I think that, look, you can't deny that the current culture of Switzerland is very different than the culture of Switzerland 400 years ago. Switzerland now is an incredibly wealthy, rich, Central European nation. 300 or 400 years ago, it was a peasant community living in the mountains, but predominantly occupied by gypsies, thieves, and vagabonds who literally hid. If you look at the origin of Switzerland, there were lots of people who went there to simply avoid detection, right? Because it was one of the most inaccessible countries in Europe. So people escaped to Switzerland for all kinds of different reasons. I think that there's a moral center to William Tell, which has a Swiss application. But I don't see it as a Swiss story. I see it as a story, essentially, as you know, Oliver. It's a story about about a small country dealing with the invasion of an autocratic regime from next door. And my God, we're still dealing with that 200 years later, right? We're still looking at that in our own present politics. So I think it's more about it's using Switzerland as a vehicle, if you like, to tell a story which has political ramifications in a much wider world.
Yeah, certainly. Well, the cast is just extraordinary. Actually, it's an all-star cast, and I wanted to ask you about Klaus Bang. So he has a real screen presence that I think draws the viewer to watching him. Certainly in movies. I mean, he isn't on TV, but I think he really works brilliantly as a movie star because he has that kind of presence. William Tell is a role that I think you need that, don't you?
Well, in my version of Tell, I've made him older. Like as Almut will talk about, there's a sense in which the original Tell is a younger man. He's pantheistic in that sense. He's of the mountains. He's peaceful. He's not somebody who wants to engage in military combat or war. But that's quite hard to dramatize. It's quite hard to actually make that work. So I wanted to give him a history. So therefore, I invented an entire backstory of the Crusades, which he would have gone as some form of mercenary in that period. And then he's come back from the Crusades with a wife because he committed certain atrocities over there that he needed to kind of cleanse himself from. And that is what makes him anti-war. The movie's an anti-war movie, but to make an anti-war movie, you have to make a war movie. So, and in Claes, what you've got is somebody, as you know, who can sit in silence in the scene and steal the scene, who has a brooding internal dialogue and an internal kind of dystopian emotional life. I would say that he's an absolutely messed up character, William Tell, in that sense. He's somebody who has seen horrors in a kind of Kurtz-like way, if you like, in a kind of heart of darkness way, and does not want to repeat them and does not want to see them. And I think with Claes, you've got somebody who can hold the screen in silence. And if an actor can hold the screen in silence, then they can hold the screen at any time. And the central point of that whole movie, and we can get onto this in a different way, is the apple scene, and that's why, weirdly, the apple scene has survived in our culture, even though most people don't know why it happened, who he shot, when he shot it, how he did it, what was it about. They know nothing about it, but they sure as hell know that there was a little boy with an apple on his head and his dad was about to shoot him. And that's why I wanted to do the picture, because that scene written by Schiller is a pure example of political terrorism. For me, it's an example of an act of fascistic control. It's the equivalence of people in yellow jumpsuits and orange jumpsuits in the desert getting their throat cut and that being advertised on social media. It's exactly that. There is nothing bucolic. There is nothing beautiful. The fact that we see it now in history, and I think, Almut could probably talk more about this. History is represented sometimes in a beautiful, elegant way. There's a young boy with an apple. His father has a feather. There's a big fat man on a horse who's going to make it all happen. And it's engravings and stories. And it's kind of written or shown, illustrated sometimes in a much more beautiful way than the reality. The reality is horrendous. A man is forcing another man to execute his son publicly in the square. That is what that scene is about. There's no way that he thinks that apple is going to get shot off that boy's head.
And that scene comes almost exactly halfway through the movie.
Correct.
And this is the kind of centerpiece for the film. Is that something? I mean, did you build the film around that?
100%. The reason for doing the movie is that scene. The reason for centering the whole film, every character in the movie goes into that scene, and everybody is changed after that scene in the film. They're kind of basically in the Schiller's play, he sort of finishes there, Tell in the play runs off into the mountains, and the next scene is he shoots Gessler, and that's the end of the play. And which is, you can't do that in a movie because there's no third act. But that scene itself, the implications, I think there's something incredible, and that's why I think the story has survived. I really do think it survived in the same ways Robin Hood survived because he robbed the rich to pay for the poor. There's something basically, at the heart of that allows people to believe. There's something at the heart of that scene that is morally complicated, but elegantly simple. And it's that simplicity of the drama of that makes it engaging and really difficult to watch.
Yeah, Alma, I wonder if we could just bring you in here, and I mean, from the drama of the apple scene, I wondered if I could ask you something a little bit more, I guess, sober in that. What was Switzerland in 1307? It is, as Nick's just mentioned, of course, it's not the Switzerland of today, but what did it look like for those who may be unfamiliar with the history?
So that's, I think, one of the clever moves of the film to give the crusading backstory. Switzerland, in some ways, is not very different in lots of ways from the Hapsburg territories, in that neither of those are central states as we understand them in contemporary discourse. And they're unlike France or England, even in the Middle Ages, in that both the Holy Roman Empire, which the Habsburg Duke wants to be emperor of, and Switzerland are confederations in which political power is quite a complicated way of getting the agreement of different parties and forging collaborations. Now, from quite early on and from the late 15th century on, the Wilhelm Tell legend clearly is part of Swiss myth-making about how their history is distinct from what goes on in the Roman Empire. and it's part of a story of the small underdog holding together against tyrannical power. So we have ballads from the late 15th century which have the apple scene, and which often also, in different versions, have the scene of the Confederates swearing the oath of allegiance to each other. And Schiller's play brings both of those together. But from the early 16th century, on the one hand, there's an awareness that that story is probably not historically accurate or true, and that it's a legend. But at the same time, there's an awareness that that legend may express something that's significant about how the Swiss Confederation sees itself. And from the 16th century chronicles on which Schiller probably bases most of his play, they use words like tyrannical and tyrant when they describe the Hapsburg Duke. Well, so that by that stage, there is a shaping of history into the confederation on the one hand, and the oppressive tyrannical power of the larger political grouping on the other.
It's also quite interesting to take Almut's point there, Oliver, that the crossbow is really important that people know about this. The crossbow, as you know, as a historian, changed history. It changed military, it changed warfare, because it was the first time in human history you could cock a weapon. It was the first time in military where that you could wait for someone. You can't cock an arrow. You can't. You have to hold a bow, and you after 2 seconds your body is shaking because the power. So you'd have to release the shot. This was the first time in history that man had invented a weapon that could propel something with such power. And it went through armor. It went through chainmail. That changed. Imagine that you've got armor and you're walking around the place thinking, well, nothing can touch me. And suddenly a crossbow goes through your chest. That changes the way people think about how warfare happened. Now, look, decades later, gunpowder came along and changed everything again. But essentially, for that little period of time, and the great thing about the crossbow is it was the peasant weapon. It wasn't taught in court. It wasn't part of the nobility's desire to learn archery. It was the weapon of the revolutionary, the renegade, the gypsy, the thief. And therefore it fits into the narrative that Almut's talking about.
I'd be slightly cautious about overplaying the peasant, because crossbows in that period are still quite an expensive piece of kit.
Right, that's interesting.
And the interesting part of the 16th century, both the historiographical and the ballad versions, is that they're very confident from the start. Wilhelm Tell presents himself as skillful. He is confident in his skills. That's the awareness of a professional who knows that he's been trained and who knows his skill. And therefore, I would think in the presentation of those sources, and up to a point, I think also still in Schiller, he takes a calculated risk. He makes a political point, but he also is confident of his skills in a way that Gessner isn't, his opponent.
So there is why, Almut, do you think that's why he takes the shot?
I think even in Schiller's presentation, there is a confidence that he has no certainty, and he knows the risk to his son. But he knows that there is a larger political question at stake, and therefore, with that confidence in his skill, he's prepared to do that.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. If you were a skilled crossbowman, Nick, you would presume, I'm imagining this happened, so you would you would obviously want to ensure that there's little wind. You aiming high, you're not gonna take any kind of. I mean, you're already taking a risk clearly, but you're gonna. I'm just thinking through logically how you would aim at an apple that's on someone's head. I know this
Yeah,
is.
I think I don't know. I think that I can see what Almut's talking about in terms of confidence. I think it's impossible to do that shot at that. It's okay if you're 15 feet away, but the crossbow's not exactly as accurate as an art as a bow and arrow. And I don't know the distance in the shot in real terms, but the equivalence that Almut's talking about is okay, if you don't take the shot, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill your son, and I'm going to kill your wife. All right. And then I'm going to dominate you anyway. If you do take the shot, you stand a very rare chance of actually doing it. But if you manage to do it, and I think that's the calculation that Almut's talking about, if you manage to do it, you've created a hero in the person because they've stood up to the tyrannical rule of the Habsburgs.
Yeah, and presumably they've only asked him to do it or ordered him to do it, forced him to do it because it's such a difficult shot.
There's no way Gessler thinks he can make that shot. There's no way that there's no way in hell that anybody would order a public event knowing that they were going to lose. I don't know. What do you think, Alma?
I agree, but I think that's also where it's quite clear from the early versions that this isn't told because people have faith that this is accurately, historically how it happened. It's part of how you tell a story in creating a hero, the hero who has skills which go beyond what could possibly be imagined. I think that's true also.
In other words, there's a Superman element to it.
It's a sort of like Achilles type thing, isn't it?
Yes, a mix of Achilles and Superman, a knowledge that, or a creation through the stories of a persona who can do things that ordinary people can't, but who, because of his moral integrity, offers an example to others of what they should emulate, as they do in the story. And as Tell demonstrates again when he jumps off the boat and kills Gessner eventually, because that's the second part of his skill as an archer, isn't it? And the film again stages that in all the drama of the dangerous journey on the boat.
Yes, I suppose so. So in what you're saying, Alma, is you're saying that in a weird way, Tell is one of the first superhero stories in European culture.
There are earlier ones,
but then who? Because is he the Disneyfication of legends? Then in terms of history, is he kind of like Marvel comics of the 14th century?
I think he's different. So the Nibelungs, Siegfried and the Nibelungs would be an earlier. That's a 13th century example of creating precisely that kind of hero and Superman figure. But the Tell story is set in a more specific political context, and it's therefore appropriated again and again in different contexts where either religious conflict in the 17th century or political conflict for Schiller in the 19th century become an issue. But yes, I think he has elements of that superhero.
I mean, that's interesting for me to hear you talk about how it was attributed politically as you go through history, because you're right. It was used by different people through different times. I mean, the Nazis loved the Schiller scene that he wrote about Rutli when they all joined together. And in fact, as you know, used actual quotes from it in the Nuremberg rallies, because it was about one race, one people joined by blood. Later on, of course, they had a different view of Schiller when they realized actually it was about individual liberty. But initially, and then the French Revolution, as you know, I mean, how did that come about that Tell was used so differently over periods?
I think one of the interesting aspects in that to me is how much obliquely in Schiller's play is still there of religious differences, because originally and again in the 19th century there are tensions between the sort of Catholic parts of the Swiss Confederation, which are often portrayed as the peasant, rural, backward areas on the one hand, and they celebrate this confederation, and the Protestant, much more urban, much more affluent from the early modern period on. And in Schiller's play, the way in which he handles that scene in which Till refuses to greet the hat on the pole still has that element of religious background in Catholic traditions, in that Schiller's Tell is rescued by a priest walking past with the sacrament just as the people are ordered to greet the hat. So they kneel and they do their reverence, but they do it to the sacrament rather than the hat. And therefore, most of that population isn't punished. And I think it's a really interesting example of Schiller as a Protestant writer clearly being aware still of Catholic traditions and using them in his play to mark how there are ways of resisting power through knowledge of traditions. And again, staging his Tell as someone who doesn't want that excuse and openly defies Gessner's power.
But that's very interesting, because that's a factor in 1848 in the year of revolutions with, Catholicism and liberalism within the Swiss Confederation. When the William Tell story comes up there, doesn't it not?
Yes, it does.
Right. Okay, Nick. So this is filmed in the Alps, the Italian Alps. Is that right?
Indeed, yeah. There's no tax breaks to film in Switzerland, which is as anybody in the business of making movies knows, is where you go to make films. That's why you have a business in the UK, because we give a tax break to film companies making films here, and that tax break is something can be up to 20-25% of the budget. And so where film production is centered in Europe is entirely conditional on the national tax rebate that you get for doing it. So the Italians at that time, and still to this day, are doing massive tax incentives and therefore have a film business which is worth billions. Amazon, Netflix are there all the time. We have the same thing in the UK. The Spanish have something similar. The French have something ridiculous, and the Germans have nothing. And so it's a very, very different map all the way across Europe as to what you can attain on a tax. And it makes a big difference, because you're putting the best part of $20 to $30 million into a local economy. And yes, you're getting some of that back, but you're employing thousands of people. So that's why we filmed it in Italy, because it's prohibitive to actually film in Switzerland, because the daily rates of your crew far exceed anything else that you would pay in Europe by times 10. And also you have no incentive to film. There is no, the Swiss will go nuts if I say this, but there is no film business in Switzerland to talk of.
I think that will come as no surprise to anyone who's visited Switzerland.
Exactly. And as you know, going to Switzerland, there is no difference between the Italian Alps, the French Alps, and the Swiss Alps. The Dolomites, and there's 4 countries, I think, that border onto it in different, or 3, I can't remember. The difference. So yes, that's part of the majesty of Schiller. That's what he uses. That's why you couldn't shoot it on the back lot in Pinewood. You can't shoot it, and put blue screen up and then map it in later. I wanted the actors to actually feel what it's like to stand on the top of a mountain and be difficult to breathe, and then actually run and fight and walk through snow and mud, because that gives you a kind of a reality to we go through those mountains with ease. Almut will tell you to make a 1-mile journey in Switzerland in the 14th century probably took you a week. All right. To go over the mountain, through the thing, over across. It was inordinately difficult to move around in that country. And that's why it has survived as a nation, because as I say in the movie, its had natural defenses are its mountains. That's why people leave it alone, because it's too difficult to conquer. Even the Germans left it alone. I mean, let's be honest, they used it as banks, but essentially they didn't need to go in because it was just going to take up too much time and effort.
Yeah, no one
there's a
bothers, do they?
Almut, sorry,
Albert, go for it.
do you think there's a parallel between you and Schiller in some ways? Because Schiller himself actually never went to Switzerland, and though his wife, but what he creates is this image of Switzerland and the prohibitive mountains
Yeah.
and the inaccessibility through his language. And I think that's quite an interesting parallel between your desire to give your actors the experience and Schiller not really knowing it himself, but creating it for us.
Did he never go? I never knew
No,
that.
he didn't. No, he was
Really? He just
thrilled.
he imagined it from pictures and
Yes,
wow.
so it was fashionable. Goethe had been several times, and of course, Goethe on his Italian journeys crossed through Switzerland and had horror stories to tell of how difficult and how atrocious the conditions were traveling through Switzerland on a stagecoach. So Schiller would have been aware of quite what an enterprise that would have been.
Can you fill me in, Almut, maybe the listeners as well? What was because as I understand it, Goethe was going to write it. Thank God he didn't. It would have been more impenetrable than Schiller. But but what happened between the two of them where Schiller wrote it and not Goethe?
So this is from the period where both of them are in Weimar and they're very close friends. And actually that friendship is one of the examples of two writers, I think, being quite aware of how very different they are in mentality, but also as writers. And some things they collaborate over. So there are poems which they co-write or where they exchange different topics. And there are occasions like this where Goethe has come across something and they talk about it. But Goethe is quite clear from early on, I think, that this isn't for him. So he tells Schiller the story and gives him some of the material. And Schiller then works with it and makes it into his play. So it's quite an unusual example of literary colleagues who are not, in that period at least, presenting as rivals, but as friends.
Probably one of the few examples where writers aren't rivals. Let's be honest. Most of the time, they're completely jealous of each other's success or non. So, but why? Who gave it the political edge? Was that Schiller?
That's Schiller. I think that's Schiller from early on, from the Räuber, the robbers on, sort of finding medieval or distant subject matter to explore contemporary political questions.
And why did he use medieval times to explore political parallels?
I think partly
The Robbers is an example of that, right? The Robbers is a classic example. It's a brilliant play, very, not performed not much, but it's a brilliant play about, a slightly dystopian world where people live alone in the mountains and go and attack the rich and survive in that way.
I suspect in some ways the attraction to Schiller is not so different from the attraction that a medieval setting has to us and as you demonstrate has to you in the film, in that on the one hand the medieval period is recognizably the roots of contemporary European society in many ways, but it's also very recognizably different. And therefore it's sometimes easier to explore big questions in a setting that feels remote.
I agree with you, but why is that? Why didn't he write, like he did Mary Stuart, he wrote that was again, it was a different period, but why do we use allegory, and why in history, in other words, do we use history to talk about contemporary issues rather than just use contemporary issues?
I mean, one answer is always that negotiating contemporary tensions can be risky. And I think Schiller was aware of that from early on as a young man, that if he got too involved directly in making political statements, his friends got incarcerated. But partly perhaps also because sometimes different historical periods offer a model of thinking outside the box or in ways that are not immediately conditioned by how contemporary society tends to see things. So this story about groups of people who come together sort of from the bottom up, rivaling against a centralized power, is perhaps easier to tell from a setting in which that is part of the political culture.
It is fascinating, isn't it, that the self-political censorship that Shakespeare's the same. Shakespeare used history all the time to talk about what was going on exactly in the court at that moment. And yet, if he'd written it about the court, he would have had his head chopped off. And I'm still doing it now. I mean, filmmakers.
Yeah, exactly. Russian writers, of course, and
we're all doing it, right? Everybody. Sometimes there's a fear to talk about your own contemporary culture.
And I think it's a mix. Sometimes there are real political risks to talking about contemporary issues directly, but I think sometimes it's also an intellectual liberation. It's difficult to talk in a historical language, but if you talk about something that's very obviously not directly our own experience, then sometimes it perhaps also allows us to recognize that our way of seeing things isn't necessarily the only one.
Fascinating. I always remember I went across to Poland. I spent a lot of time in Poland in the early 80s when it was still communist, and I was a lot of time in the theatre in Poland. And I always remember going to this performance, just a small aside. And the performance was an avant-garde theatre group. It packed, there was hundreds of people in the theatre. And the theatre was obviously censored at that moment radically. And I always remember this moment in the stage play where 100 little piglets ran across the, little plastic pigs. And the audience roared with laughter, roared. And I have got no idea why anyone was laughing and what it was about. And it was about the fact that you couldn't buy meat in the shops. But you weren't allowed to say that on stage. So you had to make it comic so the audience could see it and the censor couldn't censor it.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
And yet it's the same thing. It's what you're talking about. It's easier to talk about 14th century Switzerland and political impression than it is to talk about Ukraine or Gaza. Because by automatically we can talk in an historical way. It gives us more freedom to be politically aware, whereas the moment you talk about Ukraine or Gaza, you're on one side or the other. Is that the same as Schiller then, Alma? Is that exactly what happened?
I think that's what Schiller is doing. The interesting other parallel I was thinking of is that Max Frisch, the perhaps best known Swiss contemporary writer in the 70s, actually wrote an anti-William Tell, in which Gessner becomes the benign sort of administrator who does things because he empathizes, and in which actually Tell is the sort of autocratic, himself slightly tyrannical risk taker who doesn't quite fit. And I think that's the same attempt of writing against the sort of too easy assumptions of contemporary society.
You understand more through history than you do through contemporary politics. Wow. Yeah, I guess you're right. There you go, Oliver.
Well, I think that's exactly why everyone loves history. I think it's certainly becoming. I mean, you see the success of things like The Rest is History and stuff like that now. But I'm being asked to wrap this up. But Nick and Alma, this has been really fantastic. Nick, you've kind of done my job for me, so thank you. And I know you got the premiere on Friday. Not the premiere. It's released in cinemas in the UK on Friday. You've had the premiere already, I'm assuming. But so I wish you the best of luck with it. It's fantastic. So I mentioned the scenery because it gives us such a brilliant cinematic look, epic feel to the movie. But thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, Oliver. Thank you. Nice to see you, Almut.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you very much, Oliver.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes, and if you want to get in touch, I'm on X, or you can email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you, and good night.